Greetings and welcome to the United States Transhumanist Party Virtual Enlightenment Salon. My name is Gennady Stolyarov II, and I am the chairman of the U.S. Transhumanist Party. Here we hold conversations with some of the world's leading thinkers in longevity, science, technology, philosophy, and politics. Like the philosophers of the Age of Enlightenment, we aim to connect every field of human endeavor and arrive at new insights to achieve longer lives, greater rationality, and the progress of our civilization. Greetings, ladies and gentlemen, and welcome to our U.S. Transhumanist Party Virtual Enlightenment Salon of Sunday, November 16th, 2025. Today, we have a fascinating conversation for you and a continuation of a prior conversation about cultural drift, the risks of cultural decline, and how that decline could hopefully be prevented. And joining us today, in addition to our Director of Visual Art, Ramon Garcia, is our special guest, Professor Robin Hanson. Robin Hanson is an Associate Professor of Economics at George Mason University and received his Ph.D. in 1997 in Social Sciences from Caltech. He joined George Mason's economics faculty in 1999 after completing a 2-year postdoc at U.C. Berkeley. His major fields of interest include health policy, regulation, and formal political theory. He is also interested in all aspects of the future, which is why we are quite pleased to have him back again as our guest, including uploading nanotech, cosmology, the foundations of physics, future economic growth rates, limits of computation, and the origins of life. So quite a wide range of interests. And we had him previously as a guest on our Virtual Enlightenment Salon of August 25th, 2024. This was such a fascinating conversation that we thought it would be a great idea to continue it today and bring back some of the prior audience questions as well. But before we do that, Professor Hanson has a fairly brief presentation to recap what we discussed previously and set the stage for continuing our conversation. So, Professor Hanson, welcome, and please proceed.
Hello, everyone. So the idea is just to go quickly over the basic ideas here, just so that we're all on the same page. Civilizations have risen and fallen in history, and our civilization might also fall. And the question is, if so, what would cause that, and could we stop it? It should be a very basic concern to all futurists if our civilization is going to fall. So let's take context in biology. Species in biology are a unit of organisms, and they live in either large or small habitats. So there are like large oceans where there are big habitats, and then there are tiny rainforest sections and rivers and then coral reefs where there's lots of little habitats. And in the little habitats, you have small species with fewer members, and in the big habitats, you have big species with more members. And a key point is that these big species in the big habitats, they can do more innovation faster within the species because there's more places for innovations to start in a big species, and then it can spread to the whole species. So large species should innovate faster in terms of the features that are allowed to vary within the species. But small species can do more innovation of the features that define a species, the things that they all have to have it together. And therefore, there's going to be more innovation of species in coral reefs and rivers and rainforests. And it turns out life today more comes from that second set of habitats, meaning that evolution of species actually seems to matter more than evolution in species. Culture is a unique thing for humans compared to pretty much all the other animals. It's basically biological evolution again, but now we just have more ways to inherit behavior. So instead of just passing along your behavior through your DNA to your children from two parents, you can collect behavior from many parents, basically. And you can do that within your life. You don't have to wait till you're born and get a whole new set. And so cultural evolution can just be much faster and flexible, and it's humanity's superpower. And that's the thing that made humanity work well. And it has the same natural selection process. And it has these same two levels that we were talking about within culture evolution and between culture evolution. So if you think about corporate cultures, for example, when you have a corporation, it has a culture within there. And then there's innovation within a company, and innovation that shows up one place in a company and it can spread to all the rest parts of the company, but it's harder to spread an innovation across company boundaries. But then there's the whole corporate culture that's hard to vary within the company. And then for that, you need more companies. And so industries that are more fragmented with more companies actually are more innovative overall than industries with fewer firms, suggesting that, again, innovation of corporate culture actually matters more than innovation within corporate culture. So think of natural selection here in terms of culture or even DNA as a control problem. So make an analogy with driving a car. When you're driving a car, there's a set of parameters of the process, and if they're in a good regime, it'll work. In a bad regime, it won't. So think of the parameters. How fast are you going? How wiggly is the road? How clearly can you see the road? How quickly can you react to what you see to turn the wheel? How reliable is the wheel connection to the tires? How bumpy is the road? You can see that if all these parameters are in a good regime, you're going slowly down a road that's not moving very far, you can see clearly, you'll stay on the road. But if you turn all these parameters bad, then you'll just go into a regime where you can't stay on the road. You'll drift off the road and crash. That's a control problem. Now, natural selection is a control process too. We tend to think of natural selection as about improving and creating innovations, but its first task is to prevent things from getting worse. So natural selection needs to preserve stuff and keep it from getting worse. And so the way to think about it is there's this high dimensional space illustrated here, but think of more than just 3 dimensions, 10, 1,000 dimensions. And in this high dimensional space, there's some adaptive region. There's a region where things are good, and there's a bunch of points in this space. And points near the middle of this adaptive region, they grow and they split. Points away from this region shrink and die. And the task of natural selection initially is just to have this cloud of points track this region, because this region is going to move. And as the region moves, some of the points should stay close to it so that those points can split and grow so that the whole cloud, some of the points will die and go away, but the cloud can keep tracking as long as some of the points are closer. So there's 4 key parameters of this process. One is how many points are there? You can tell if there's just one point, it's going to be harder to track the region. 2 is how big is this effect of points in the region growing, points out shrinking. If there's not much of an effect, it won't track the region. 3rd, how fast is this region moving? The faster it moves, the harder that'll be. And 4th, how much do these points just wiggle independently of all these other things? Because the more they just randomly wiggle a lot, it'll be hard to track the region. So those are the 4 key parameters of this natural selection process of DNA and of culture. And the problem is going to be at the culture level, as opposed to the within, not the within cultures. So it's the between cultures. So let's go to macro cultures. So think 3 centuries ago in our world. The world was full of lots of little peasant cultures, each with 1,000 or 2 people in it. Near the edge of survival, they had pandemics and famines and wars all the time. So they were subject to strong selection. There were hundreds of thousands of these things. The world changed slowly. That is, the world economy doubled roughly every 1,000 years back long ago. So the adaptive region was changing slowly, and they were very conservative cultures. They were trying not to change. So arguably that was a good regime for cultural evolution. These cultures could track the world effectively, and they did. But now, over the last few centuries, what's changed? First, we took peasant cultures and we smashed them into a national culture. So we had much less variety, from hundreds of thousands down to hundreds. Then we merged at least the elite parts of these national cultures into a global monoculture, a vast reduction in variety. Selection effects are way down because as we've gotten rich and peaceful and healthy, we're not dying off. So these cultures aren't dying off. Third, the world is changing much faster. So the world economy now doubles every 15 to 20 years instead of 1,000 years. So the rate at which culture needs to adapt to this rapidly changing world is much faster. And finally, in place of conservative cultures that were trying not to change, we decided we were eager for cultural change. So the modern world has cultural activists who are eager to cause cultural change. They have all these agendas they're trying to push to cause cultural change. And unfortunately, most of that isn't tracking adaptive pressures. So from the point of view of this selection process, it's just random wiggling. And so that's the reason to worry now. Our macro cultures, the few remaining, are not tracking the adaptive region as it moves. So it's like the car driving off the road. And that's the key problem here. So the prediction, notice, is that within cultural evolution should be great. Having just a few macro cultures means that innovation within them can spread to any other part of them. And that should be having record levels of technology and business practice innovation. That's predicted by having too few cultures. The problem is the shared features of cultures, attitudes toward democracy and war and family and patriotism and death and work and, those sorts of key attitudes of that drive human behavior. Those are the things we wouldn't have enough variety in. And plausibly, this could explain many ways in which culture has become maladaptive. That is, norms and values markers could plausibly be becoming maladaptive over the last few centuries as a result of this. Probably the most clearest example would be fertility fall, which seems to be about to cause a population decline. There are ways that those seem to be primarily caused by a number of cultural trends that we can identify, talk to if you want, that the proximate cause of fertility decline is cultural change. And then why are these cultures changing? Plausibly just because of cultural drift is what we've been talking about, this process by which culture drifts off the road. And rather than, we're not going to focus on that at the moment, but there are ways we could think about fixing fertility. But if we think about ways to fix this cultural drift problem, first of all, at the highest level, I think there's two possible fixes. Basically, we're on a ship heading for an iceberg. There are two things you can do. You can try to wrest control of the whole ship and turn the wheel to turn the whole ship, or you can try to get off on lifeboats. Those are the two key options. So we could try to reform and improve the shared monoculture of the world and try to get it to become more adaptive, to follow a new process of making its changes, or we can abandon it and try to make new subcultures that are resisting. So in terms of fertility, basically, long ago, the Christians took over the Roman Empire by doubling every 20 years for 3 centuries. And the Amish and Haredim are at the moment doubling every 20 years. The Amish have been doing that for over a century. If they keep doing that for another couple of centuries, then they could dominate the world. And their key is that they resist influence by the macro culture, the shared world culture. They are very insular, part due to being religious. And so they just have their own separate world where they have their own culture and therefore can promote their own fertility. So an approach of getting off on the lifeboats is try to do that sort of thing. Join one of these subcultures that's growing instead of the shared world thinking, or try to create a new transhumanist, perhaps, insular subculture that would have high fertility and then escape the shrinking of the rest of the world. Or we can try to turn the whole ship. There are some sort of ways to think about what we could do. If we don't do anything, plausibly, not only will this civilization fall like past ones have, but when the next one rises, it would fall again, because the same process could be behind the rise and fall of all of these. Eventually, if we get spread across different stars in the future, they could be so far apart that they couldn't be synchronized. You'd at least have multiple independent cultures, but that's a long way off. We could try. Obviously, if we could return to strong war and pandemics, then yay, we would get more selection pressure, but nobody wants that. Maybe we could try to get stronger fertility. Hey, if we get AIs, they could at least prevent population decline. And that would be, and they might, if we allowed them to be Malthusian, they could have stronger selection pressures within them, but they could still have the problem of a world monoculture of AIs, unless the AIs fragment somehow into very separate insular subcultures. The whole world culture of AIs could still have this cultural drift problem. We could try to change culture to become more adaptive. We could have a kind of multiculturalism that's deeper. So today when people talk about multiculturalism, they tend to think of a shallow kind of multiculturalism, i.e. different food and songs and holidays. People like that kind of multiculturalism. But if you talk about people having different attitudes toward gender or sex or death, war, people hate that kind of multiculturalism and they work hard to suppress it. So you'd somehow need to get a lot more of that. You could try to return to a past culture, but somehow you need to generalize it from its original context. You could somehow have a world that just celebrated and eagerly pursued social Darwinism, but as you know, people hate that idea. We could try to reduce the scope of culture by taking more choices out of the shared scope of the choices we make together and into more choices we can make different by having, say, capitalism, choose more things in the world, less reliance on status markers to make choices. And finally, my favorite solution is a long shot, which is just to have a much stronger form of governance. I am the inventor of a form of governance called futarchy, and it's undergoing trials now. Finally, invented 26 years ago, but now finally, over the last few years, a couple of companies and other organizations have been trying it. If those success trials continue to be successful, then maybe we'll have a more competent form of governance. And then the idea is to hand that task over to this government. And so the mechanism is briefly, you have a asset that represents the value you're trying to achieve that goes up, the price goes up and down when people's estimate of that value goes up and down. You split that asset into two conditional markets where you trade the asset conditional on making a particular decision, yes versus no. There's the yes value of the asset, the no value of the asset. If the yes price is higher than the no, that's the market saying, yes, you want to do this so that the price goes up, so that your value gets achieved. That's this key concept that's being tested. And got a bit of history I won't tell you about. Then in order to make this work, what we actually would need to do is find a sacred goal. And that's probably why I've been invited back here, is that because if you just give it the goal of preventing civilization decline, that won't actually work, because once the mechanism starts to demand sacrifices of us in the name of this goal, we'll go, well, we don't like that, so forget it, let's change the goal. We'd need a goal that we would be committed to. That is, because it was sacred to us, we would be ashamed to abandon it, and we would be proud to sacrifice it. And we'd need that goal to also be a goal that was inconsistent with civilization decline. So when I did some polls, here are some things near the top are, say, when a lot of people live in space, or when we produce immortality. Those are goals that many people think we could treat as a sacred goal, plausibly, that we would be attached to and proud to sacrifice for. And they do seem to be inconsistent with civilization decline. And so then if you just gave those goals to an incompetent form of governance, like the ones we have now, that won't work, because they won't actually achieve the goal. They'll just say they are. But if you have a competent form of governance where you can give it a goal and then it will actually achieve it, then by giving it a goal inconsistent with civilization decline, you would in fact prevent civilization decline. And then a shared large part of the world that shared such a governance mechanism tied to such a sacred goal could in fact plausibly prevent civil, i.e. this is the way to turn the whole ship of the world culture. And that's the quick description of my concept. And I have succeeded in roughly 15-minute summary here of what we talked about much longer last time. And of course, we will review things as necessary to get clearer on them in this coming discussion over the next hour and 40 minutes.
Excellent. Well, thank you very much for this overview. And indeed, the reason why I thought it would be worthwhile to continue this conversation is because this approach of emphasizing a sacred goal seems to be the most powerful of the potential solutions that you have articulated, if we could make it work. Before we quite get to that point in the discussion, because you mentioned some other possibilities, I wanted to bring up certain past audience questions that could be relevant, and we will get back to the slides, especially the slide on the sacred goals, because I would like to explore those with you later. But first, in terms of certain audience members, they were wondering, well, does declining fertility necessarily cause declining innovation, or can we compensate for that through various ways? And you did point out some of them. I was thinking, could we cultivate individuals more intensively? Like, yes, we have more intensive parenting now. So most families don't have 8 kids. They might have 1 kid, but they would put a lot of resources into that 1 kid. Instead of working on the farm all day, that person can actually study quite a bit, become competent in a variety of disciplines, and eventually become much more innovative than the average person who was raised to work on a farm 200-300 years ago. Also, another possibility would be using more automation and and AI, it seems that the AI agents that are emerging today are, let's say, very basic versions of the M's that you have written about, and they're already starting to post on X, Twitter. They're already starting to engage in conversations with people. Some people might think they're stimulating certain ideas, certain intellectual discourse that might not have happened otherwise. So there's some promise in that. Also, cultural changes to value innovation more. Some people don't value innovation as much as perhaps we might want them to. And could they be persuaded to think in more innovative ways? And even if there are fewer people in absolute terms, there will be more innovative people who explicitly value innovation. So these are, let's say, some fairly proximate ways in which fertility decline can be compensated for. I would be happy to go into some, let's say, less proximate ways, but these seem very directly accessible today. So what do you think about these alternatives?
So this is responding to a point I didn't make in today's summary because I went very quickly and didn't talk much about the fertility problem. But a key problem with declining fertility is that the population then declines, and then the economy declines, and then plausibly, I argued, innovation rates decline. And that has consequences for cutting liberality and other sorts of features of our society. So the overall typical approximation is that innovation rates are roughly proportional to overall rates of economic activity. Now, you might say, well, that's overall an average. Couldn't we change more specifically to have some people be much more innovative? Now, in our world today, say Silicon Valley is accepted as being unusually innovative. And many places around the world have said, we want to be the next Silicon Valley of X, whatever X is. And they put a lot of effort into trying to reproduce Silicon Valley elsewhere, largely failing. So for the last century even, the world has known that innovation has been the route to wealth and power in the world. And so nations all around the world have said, how can we be more innovative? And they have tried somewhat to be more innovative, but largely failed to purposely become more innovative. The world doesn't seem to know how, actually, because overall rates of innovation haven't actually changed that much in the last century or so, even though we've decided to increase the priority. We spend a lot more on research and development than we did a century ago, by a factor of 10 or something, at least in terms of even percentage of the economy. But even so, rates of innovation have just not increased very much. And in the places that really put in an effort to say, let's be like the next Silicon Valley here, they have not actually succeeded in becoming the next Silicon Valley. So even though there are, in fact, large variations in how innovative companies are and places are, it just seems like we don't know how to purposely achieve that. So that's why I would still stick with the overall approximation that if population declines, plausibly. I mean, another question is, when population peaks, the West will have already been declining and Africa will be rising. So a key question in that intermediate period is, can Africa pick up the innovation tasks that the West would be dropping? Can African population be as innovative as the West? And even then we have a problem with population declines, but I think there's reason to worry that Africa may just not be as innovative as the West has been, and therefore innovation rates could well peak before population does.
Yes, very interesting. And certainly for Africa to be as innovative as the West, Africa is going to need to develop the infrastructure for innovation. When I've spoken with Africans who have been interested in transhumanism and entrepreneurship and bringing more technology to African countries, they have stated that, yes, there is an eager, largely young population that is willing to learn, that is willing to innovate, but they have real problems with infrastructure, poor roads, poor electrical access, water access, internet access, a lot of corruption, a lot of crime. And to overcome that will require massive effort. Many of them would rather move to a Western country and become more innovative there. And they're certainly quite motivated to do that, at least among the people with whom I've conversed.
I mean, if they're allowed, that's fine. It doesn't matter that it happens in Africa. There'll just be a lot of Africans then, and we just would want to be innovative anywhere. So if we could make them innovative by moving them to the West, great. But the question is, will they move? And then if they do move, will they be as innovative?
Mhm. Yes, indeed. So if the issue is a declining population is likely to cause a decline in innovation, and maybe we don't know exactly how, but we haven't been able to figure out acceptable substitutes in, let's say, an intermediate term, could there be more of a transhumanist policy involving ectogenesis? So let's say people's willingness to reproduce in the old-fashioned way has declined and will continue to decline, and that kind of reproduction, though nobody will put barriers in the way of it, is not going to be enough to replenish the current levels of population. But artificial wombs are advancing. So there have already been successful experiments in terms of incubating organisms like baby sheep in artificial wombs. It's not inconceivable that within 20 years, we could have sufficiently reliable artificial womb technology to incubate humans. So could there be a policy stating that we will target a population growth of X% if people voluntarily fulfill that goal? That's great. But if they don't, then the shortfall will be supplied through an ectogenesis program. And then for those children who are born, there could be perhaps some families willing to adopt them. For those who are not adopted, we will educate them. So we will have an education program for the next generation of maybe transhumanist inclined children too, because there might be a normative component to that, and that would slow down the population decline or maybe avert it. What do you think of that possibility?
So IVF has been a technology for assisting with birth for over a half century now. And I think the stats at the moment are IVF still is a really minor contribution to overall birth rates. And if you look at, say, 40-year-olds or even over 40, today they're having births at a lower rate than they did in, say, 1900. And it's mostly because of unwillingness to have the kids. That is, if you have a kid, then it's a lot of work to raise them. And so people today are not being willing to go through all that work. So if you could somehow get women to have kids and then raise them in an orphanage, then maybe you could substitute for the unwillingness of women to raise and their husbands, of course, to raise the kids. But even today, we find it quite hard to sort of just pay women to have kids. So, I mean, if we're going to continue to rely on the willingness of people to have kids voluntarily and then raise them voluntarily, then it's, these technologies aren't the limiting factor. It's the limiting factor is people just not willing to have and raise the kids. Obviously, if you could, substitute a form of capitalism in where we'll pay women to have kids and then pay orphanages to raise the kids and then say to parents, you don't have to, raise the kids. We'll do it for you. Then you could have a lot more kids, but people just don't like that idea mostly of for-profit orphanages or even large government orphanage houses, raising most kids.
Yes, and I would foresee some, let's say, cultural resistance to that idea. I think there would have to be an extreme assurance that the upbringing would be of good quality. So one potential arrangement that does seem to work to some extent is the kibbutz in Israel, where children are raised in rather communal settings.
But parents in the kibbutz put a lot of work into parenting. This is not, not parenting. That is parenting. Yes, there's shared communal parenting, but they put a lot of work into parenting.
Yes, fair enough. So then there's also the possibility of, let's say, a more intensive multiculturalism. And there were several questions along these lines. So one question was, given that American culture has the tendency to borrow elements from most cultures, is it possible for American culture to incorporate the between culture competition into itself through a more pronounced hyperpluralism that is specifically cultivated? So maybe we could have some basic ground rules like don't kill one another, don't enslave one another, don't abuse your kids, but within those parameters, there's a great variety of, say, educational approaches or lifestyle approaches. And it's not just, say, foods or music or clothing styles. You really could create your own little society, your own little microcosm, and largely self-regulate and see what happens, as long as you don't wage war on other little societies. And there would be some sort of macro framework, but it would be pretty laissez-faire.
So separate out making it possible for people to make very separate cultures and the willingness or inclination to do so. First of all, this is largely a world problem now, no longer just a U.S. culture isn't actually that different from the rest of the world culture on most of these cultural things. It's more of a world, especially among elites. And the main proximate cause of this lower cultural variety is the fact that we trade and talk and travel more all around the world. That is, we are just more integrated and more connected to each other. So to resist that and to reverse it, we would have to become more insular, right? To resist interacting, traveling, talking with all these other people in the world. And most people aren't very inclined to do that. So the question is, how do you get them even inclined to those sorts of variations? But then there are, again, some variations, but we have all sorts of, cultures of fandom, say, and people liking different kinds, again, food and drink and songs and holidays and things like that. We tend to celebrate that kind of variety. Unfortunately, the kind we need is the kind that's more basic life practices. And then when you look at people who have different attitudes to, say, gender equality or to death or to war or to democracy, when you see different attitudes toward that, people call those Nazis and they want to crush it. And there's just not much interest and tolerance for that kind of variety. So that is, first of all, you get some people have to want to be that variety. Then you have to get other people to allow it, to support that, letting them be different. So for example, if you look at, say, COVID, we had, 100 countries in the world that could have had 100 different policy experiments, but we, in fact, mostly did pretty much the same thing in the whole world around, because people shared a world culture and they, in fact, not only thought together about what to do the same, whenever anybody did it different, they said, shame, shame on Sweden. How dare you do something different than the rest of us are doing? We need to stop you from doing that different. Or today, the only country in the world, I think, that allows organ sales is Iran, and bioethicists get together a lot and talk about how are we going to make Iran stop deviating from the world consensus that there shouldn't be organ sales. And that's just true in a lot of areas of regulation and culture, that there's relatively little variety. And when there is variety, the main energy is to try to squash it, to try to stop that variety.
So I'm wondering, though, in terms of variety, isn't an approach like multiculturalism likely to preserve more variety? So Siba Chamuza, our foreign ambassador from Togo, previously asked, is multiculturalism in the broad sense of the term not one of the essential sources of the power and success of the United States? So the United States as the foundation, in a way, for the current global monoculture, in the sense that so many countries, societies, places around the world have adopted elements of American culture. The United States, too, has borrowed elements from a lot of other cultures it has come into contact with and hasn't been insular. So some of our viewers, like Michael Lazine, wonder, well, is insular really good, or can being too insular, let's say, circumscribe the ability of a culture to persist in the face of changing external circumstances? So America has been a fairly robust culture precisely because there has been a great deal of adaptability. On the other hand, the point that you're making is that the American culture has become so much a part of the global monoculture that there could be some variations outside of the American culture as it exists today that are just roundly rejected, even if they may be adaptive to future changes. So could there be some sort of policy of assimilating smaller cultures and not killing them off through selection pressures, but letting them remain and seeing how they might be drawn upon as needed, even if they don't become the main culture, they don't become the monoculture, but we try to be humane. We don't want to eradicate any group of people or any culture as long as it's peaceful. So is there a way to do that? Is there a way to create, let's say, a macro culture that has between culture competition inside it?
So over the last few centuries, a key trend was that some cultures became more powerful and more rich and more widely known around the world. And then as other cultures started to become aware of these more rich, powerful cultures, they largely said, we need to copy some of that or we're going to be left behind. And there's been a large degree of copying the most successful over the last few centuries, where a big energy of cultural convergence has been cultures dropping their previous features and adopting the more modern or successful features. And that's part of why the world is much more homogeneous today. And there's often like an emptying out. So you might think of, say, Mexican Americans. Like they retain their Mexican identity by some foods and some clothes and some holidays, maybe some, TV shows they like, but mostly they're pretty much the same as everybody else. Whereas like half century or a century ago, they would have been a lot more different. They would have retained things. But this has happened for many in the United States. Many kinds of cultures come here and they retain some surface differences and some surface identity, but much of their basic practices are adapting or switching to the common practices in the United States. And that's how the whole world is going now, but really. And yes, almost everybody thinks if I were to become insular and, just retain my old ways, I would be losing out compared to all the advantages I can get by adopting the global standard practices. And yes, almost everybody else thinks I don't want to lose out. I want to join the world consensus and be like everybody else so that I don't fail. And that's been the energy for this huge convergence. But the problem is about that cloud of points. We just have the one point now. And so if it wiggles randomly in one direction and the adaptive region goes in another direction, we're just going to lose that connection. And you need a cloud of points to track it, but we don't have the cloud of points. And nobody wants to be the points that would be away from where everybody else is, because they would lose out. Not only, might they have worse technology, et cetera, but they would just be at odds with other people and less easily assimilate into other people. So for example, here's a piece of evidence. When I meet elite people around the world, which I do sometimes, especially young, ambitious people, they tell me two things. So say they're from Brazil. They tell me Brazilians have some unique features that the world should value. They have a unique personality and things they're good at. And, yes, they're different in some ways, but that's good for the world. And then they also tell me that they personally will fit in just fine in any elite organization. They have no distinguishing features that will be any trouble whatsoever for being part of elite organizations around the world. And in fact, they are pretty much the same as all the other elite people in terms of how they carry themselves and their personalities and their capabilities. So that's this strong convergence of young, ambitious, elite people all around the world today, and has been for a while. They eagerly try to figure out what is the elite shared culture and try to act like that and have the same taste as other people like that and the same capacities and do meetings the same, et cetera, because they all are ambitious people wanting to fit in. But then we all have this single shared elite culture.
Interesting. And I do observe that there is this singular elite culture that a lot of people at least aspire toward. Sometimes I think they kind of undermine themselves, because if they aspired more for success in, let's say, a smaller setting, a more local setting, at least relatively speaking, they would be more akin to big fish in small ponds, and they would actually win out over being in a singular competition with all of the elites from all over
Indeed.
The world.
So in college, if you have a program, say in politics, and now you call it national or international politics, students are much more interested. If you have a business program, you call it, this is international business, and people love to go over that. That is, students just love to associate with these larger units and see that as more prestigious. And nobody wants to do local politics. You're a politician, you want to be national or international politics, right? So yes, but there's a lot of jobs in local politics and local business. But I mean, most business is local business, but people want to be involved in international business. Why? Because they like the grand prestige of these large units.
Yes, it seems that the drive for prestige in many people overshadows the drive for actual success. And there are other examples of this. So highly vertical industries like, say, Hollywood. A lot of people move to the Los Angeles area thinking they will strike it big. They will become some famous actor or famous singer. Of course, most of them won't, even by the sheer lack of available slots for those kinds of roles. So they end up underperforming relative to their potential had their aspirations been, let's say, more down to earth or in industries where the pyramid is not so steeply sloped. So it seems the problem, or one of the main problems here, isn't that there's a dominant culture that's intentionally eating up all the other cultures and erasing variety. It's that there is something in the incentive structure for many people that leads them to gravitate toward making themselves and their own behaviors, habits, aspirations more homogeneous, even if the dominant culture is pretty lax and tolerant. Like, most American elites aren't going to say, you have to be exactly like us in every single respect. They're actually fairly tolerant of variety. So would you say it's just the incentive structure of how people themselves respond to a very successful, generally speaking, monoculture?
Humans just have this strong tendency to, when they interact with other people, create a shared culture. And that includes shared expectations about dress and accents and food and how you carry yourself and when you show up at work and all these sorts of things. That's just forever for humanity been a thing that's happened. When you have multiple cultures come together, then it takes some time for them to produce a shared culture, but that does consistently happen. So that's where we're in right now.
Yes, indeed. So now I think it's a good idea to revisit the sacred goals. So I will bring up this slide once again, because even in a monoculture, it is hypothetically possible to have a sacred goal that motivates a lot of people, and it could be seen as a source of status and prestige. And it's interesting, too, the top two goals that you've listed here based on your survey are having an off-Earth population and preventing human extinction. Those seem to be very sensible, but very low mortality is in third or tied with second place, I suppose, with preparing to fight aliens. I'm not sure we need a belligerent stance toward potential alien visitors, but very low mortality is, of course, the goal or a framing of the goal that transhumanists would very much identify with. And it could solve a lot of problems in addition to being inherently worthwhile, because then population decline would be slowed. A lot of very innovative people would stay around and remain biologically younger and would be able to continue to contribute and innovate. So the issue, the obstacle that I'm seeing as a transhumanist is, how do you get this extremely large monoculture, which has very entrenched institutions and constituencies, to embrace a goal like this? And I would invite you to discuss that, invite you to discuss what you think are some of the characteristics of these sacred goals that would make them easier to formulate or implement. And do you see a path from our current society to a society where even, let's say, the American-derived world monoculture embraces very low mortality or radical life extension, or any other of the sacred goals that you've displayed?
So I switched the slide to a slide on modernism that we didn't go over before, because I want to highlight what I would see as the main obstacle is that roughly around 1900, the world just radically changed its stance toward culture. Up until that point, most everywhere was very conservative and didn't want to change culture, even though it was changing culture. So if you look at, say, a novel like Middlemarch, it describes a world where the world is changing, like railroads are coming to the town in England, but the society sees itself as very stable. And then around 1900, we have the rise of modernism, where not only is there a perception of large change, not just of technology, but of culture, but there's an eagerness to cause cultural change. This is the rise of youth movements and cultural activism. And since then, we've had an enormous rate at which culture's been changing, largely driven by youth movements. So it isn't that people couldn't come to value immortality or people living in space. Those are plausible things that people could value. The point is that if you try to get people to value that, you are fighting all these other people eager to push it in other directions. We decided that the most prestigious people in our society are the people who cause cultural change, cultural values and norms to change. And so since around 1900, it corresponds with the rise of high school. Basically, that created youth culture because we had all the kids who used to be spread out across adults and different workplaces now all together, and with creating their own youth culture, then with college students all together. And then these youth cultures are just eager to cause cultural change. They cause cultural youth movements. And that's been this repeated process over the last century and a half of cultural change. So if you look at culture today, it really has changed a lot over the last 100 century or so in terms of what we value, what are our key norms, what are our priorities. And and plausibly, a lot of this is cultural drift, i.e. not adaptive change. But whoever wants to push culture in any direction is fighting against all the other people eager to gain prestige by pushing culture in some other direction. And that's the more fundamental problem here. Like, for example, over the last, say, decade or two, anti-racism, anti-sexism became a big goal of cultural change, and people prioritized that and made that more important than other things. And it's not so much they're against immortality, they're against distracting from the most important thing they see, and anybody who's pushing something else can be suspected of being somebody in opposition to the key goals that the current youth movement is pushing. And so can you get the next youth movement to take one of these goals on? But even if you do, then the next youth movement after that will change their mind and have some other goal. And the point is, we need these goals to be stable, sacred goals, not just a movement shows up that values it and then fades away while something else comes up. We need them to last for centuries. And are we willing to make sacrifices in the name of them over centuries?
Yes, thank you for that explanation. And it's interesting that you mentioned youth culture, because we are aware of an attempt previously, actually quite some time ago, to introduce an element of the pursuit of radical life extension into youth culture. We had a virtual enlightenment salon with a gentleman named Carl Carlisle back in 2023. And at the time, he was 83 years old, but he had been a youth activist in the early 1960s in what was called SLAM, the Student League for the Abolition of Mortality. And subsequent to his work in SLAM, he did some activism in the LA area to actually get Mayor Brady of Los Angeles to issue a proclamation about support for anti-aging research. But in the 1980s, he decided that it would be worthwhile to try to attract more young people to the cause of radical life extension by creating essentially rock songs that young people could listen to. His moniker was Johnny Forever, and he had essentially rock songs on immortality. He thought that would kind of ignite a youth movement and change the culture. I don't think he had as much success as he hoped, and he actually lamented in that salon that he wished he had stuck with more of the political activism instead of being distracted by the attempt to culturally change the preferences of young people. But it's just astonishing. This was an attempt to change the youth culture, but it seemed not to have the momentum. And the tragic story of Carl Carlyle, as far as I'm aware, is unfortunately he died at the age of 85 earlier this year. So I think, unfortunately, he was born too soon. Maybe he didn't pick the approach that would have most expeditiously arrived at longevity, escape velocity for himself. But is there some more effective way to alter the youth culture, or is that not the correct target for a sacred goal?
Transhumanism was a bit of a youth movement a little 2 to 3 decades ago. Mm-hmm. That's where the name got started. There were people who had more of a futurist youth movement at the time, and this was one of the brands and streams of that. It's fighting with all these other bids for which way to move culture, and usually many bids at any one time, and then some of them win out and most of them don't, right? That's the nature of activism. So, your Carlyle might have regretted that he didn't pick the most popular activist stream, because then he could have been part of the winning popular activist group, as opposed to having chosen an also ran that wasn't the winner.
Hmm. Yes, indeed. But do you think there's any realistic hope for another youth movement based on transhumanism, futurism, longevity, especially today where there are so many youth influencers on social media, and it seems to be a very, let's say, fragmented youth culture, but increasingly one where the norms, the communication styles are a bit indecipherable, even to older people who might have been in previous youth cultures, but they're so scattered across the web. Like they have their Discord servers and they create their own little subcultures. How can they be reached?
So consider the analog to, say, the stock market. Mm-hmm. Lots of people would like to predict which way the stock market's going to go, because then they can make a lot of money buying low, selling high, et cetera, right? And our theory of the stock market is that the net effect of all those people trying to predict which way the stock market's going to go ends up with a stock market where it's very hard to predict which way it'll go. Mm-hmm. It's a random process. And our standard story of fashion is pretty similar. There are all these people, say clothing companies and marketing companies, et cetera, that would love to predict which way fashions are going to go, because then they could make products ahead of time and set up their marketing campaigns to match the fashions of the time. And the net, our standard story of fashion is that it's actually pretty random. The net effect of all these different groups trying to predict which way fashion is going to go and maybe push it to go their direction ends up with a world of fashion that's kind of random, and that you can't predict which way it's going to go. And that's sort of the nature of fashion. And so this is basically cultural fashion. Yes. Which kinds of activisms are going to be popular? And so that means these various things you might hope to become the fashion are candidates. That's not like they're ruled out. The whole point is they could become the fashion, but then they could not. It depends a lot on lots of random things. I might more think, could you be ready so that if it was starting to become a fashion, that you could suddenly be ready to jump in and take advantage of that, rather than asking, can you predict it? Are you ready for it? So it's like with the weather. The weather's hard to predict, but when there's a snowstorm, you want the right sort of people to be ready to come in and get rid of the snow. In the stock market, you don't know which tech things are going to burst, but if you are flexible enough with your resources, you can be ready to take advantage of the next burst of tech fashion.
So it's more a matter of being ready as an organization, as a movement, having the people, having the resources, having the ability to articulate a case for why a particular goal is important if one observes all of a sudden a spike in interest in it, or some relevant cultural events on which one could comment and say, okay, here's why we can contribute to this.
I mean, so for example, for immortality, I wouldn't say we're actually seeing a substantial burst in immortality per se. We are seeing activity as we have and interest, but it's sort of more steady. But space is actually at an unusual burst of capability. SpaceX has, over the last 10 years, produced amazing, widely recognized to be surprisingly capable new space capabilities. And that has made a lot of people excited about how much space activity could happen in the near future. And so that is a momentum that you could build on to create the sacred goal of lots of people living off of space. And again, polls show that pretty near the top. So I think it's not crazy to try to get that going. Now, it so happens that I was just at a meeting of space policy people last Thursday. And I said, basically, look, the biggest issue in space policy right now has to be SpaceX. They're being the winners. They're producing all this stuff, but they could be overextended. If the way Musk does his companies, I could sort of believe that he made some gambles that, are at risk of failing. And so I would think the best thing to do is to make sure those gambles don't fail, like figure out how to get obstacles out of his way and make space boom in the way that he and others would hope. And then that energy and momentum would create excitement for more people living in space. And that would make it more possible for society to get united around this goal of more people living in space. And these space policy people, unfortunately, their main reaction was, SpaceX is dominating too much the space industry. It's too much concentration of power. We need to suppress SpaceX so that other kinds of space companies can have more room to compete with it. And so, their priority isn't space activity per se. It's making sure their various space organizations get proper respect and attention in space policy.
Yes. And that can happen within a particular movement where there's fragmentation or there are internal rivalries, and sometimes the success of one's organization or one's friend circle or oneself personally may overshadow the mission, the success of the goal. And that is something I think any group of people, any movement need to be vigilant about. It's interesting too, because in space, the sacred goals are easier to articulate. I'm aware of an initiative called Asgardia. They refer to themselves as the Space Kingdom of Asgardia. It's a virtual nation. It has several 100,000 members, but their goal essentially is to advance the infrastructure of space to the extent that a person could be born in space, and they have a very specific benchmark that if there's a birth in space, then they have succeeded in their goal. It's conceivable to have other goals like a base on the moon, a base on Mars. It's conceivable to even have a sequence of goals where you can say, okay, base on the moon is more realistic in the near future, so that'll be our first goal. A base on Mars will be our second goal, etc., though some people may disagree about that sequence. I'm curious if you think something similar can be formulated for a series of life extension goals. So, for instance, one goal might be have somebody exceed the lifespan of Jean Calment. I think that's fairly reasonable to achieve within the next decade or so, and then go out from there. What are your thoughts on some realistic goals that could still be quite motivational to people?
Well, if you recall, the reason I was focused on finding a sacred goal for us to pursue was this hope that that could prevent cultural drift and civilization decline if we could have a competent form of governance pursue it. But that would require that those goal choices be made by that competent form of governance. That is, you'd give it the overall goal that's a long-term goal, and you would let it decide these shorter-term sub-goals and which are the most effective to achieve. As soon as you start to have us all talk together about what we think the short-term sub-goals should be, and then, get excited about that and get some coalition around that, then you've lost the power of actually doing it well, and more substituted sort of political fashion about it. So then I would rather we figure out what would be the long-term goal that we could agree on, and then agree that we want to put something in charge of that, and then trust what it decides as the way to achieve it. So that's a key problem here you see with futarchy and other sort of politics. Like more specifically on space, a lot of people are just very wary of letting capitalism go wild in space. even though, we have these history of, say, the Wild West and capitalism helping, us this, they don't want that sort of a capitalist process to be the thing that runs space. But, quite plausibly, that means they don't want space, because that's most plausibly the way it can and would be achieved if it's going to be achieved. And so I think one big obstacle here is just to get people to be committed enough to the goal of space relative to the other goals they have about antitrust or, world egalitarianism or some sort of a, non-capitalist sorts of venture in space or something. And the more that you're going to put all those other goals in on this, the less you're actually going to be able to achieve it, and the less it would prevent civilization decline. So that's be the nature of a sacred goal. If you pick that goal, then you're willing to sacrifice many other things for that goal because it's the important thing. And so in some sense, we're not quite there yet with space, but the goal would be that these other things that are in the way in people's minds, we don't want to go to the moon if the moon has to have property, and then somebody might buy up the good parts of the moon too early before the rest of us can get out there. If that's your priority, then, well, you don't really prioritize space. If you prioritize space, you'd say, whatever it takes, that's the important thing, let's do it. And you'd be willing to accept many other sacrifices for that.
Very interesting. So I take it you don't think it would be a particularly effective approach to have something like a little orange handbook of goals that are laid out in a systematic fashion, and then you distribute a lot of copies of that handbook to people, and they carry it around and they read about the goals and they understand the goals and they essentially make life choices on the basis of pursuing the goals. You would favor a mechanism that essentially calibrates the sub goals in real time, and the sacred goal is more of an overall culture-wide understanding without a lot of the details.
We're showing how big of an ask this is. That maybe from a distance it seemed feasible, but now we're realizing how hard this scenario is. Civilization's default is likely to fall and collapse like the Roman Empire did, and that's what's going to happen from us doing the local things that feel good and that are the result of all our usual local politics, etc. The question is, can we somehow escape that fate? And the idea is, if we just said, let's make sure civilization doesn't decline, and we had a competent form of governance, we assigned that, it wouldn't actually work, because as soon as it asked us to sacrifice, we'd go to hell with that. That's too much trouble. Let's, do something easier and give it a different goal, right? So the only way we're actually going to prevent civilization to collapse with a competent form of government is to give it a goal and then stick with that goal and have that a goal we care about that happens to be inconsistent with civilization decline. We won't actually care enough about decline for that to be our goal, but maybe some other goal could be something we're more strongly attached to. And maybe when 1 million people live off of space, making that date be as soon as possible could be the sort of goal that we would feel very attached to. And then when a competent government does things to achieve that at the moment feel like sacrifices, we would be proud of that instead of ashamed. And we would not give up on the goal. And we would be all the more committed to seeing that we were moving toward the goal and we were sacrificing for it. But that requires that we really are attached to this goal. And it's more important than these other things that we might bring up as, contrary considerations to the goal. Oh, what about democracy in space? Oh, what about making sure there aren't billionaires out there, blah, blah, blah. The more those are your key goals, where your goal isn't space, the goal is a bunch of other things, and you're not actually going to achieve it. So the ask here has to be, no, this goal has to be a really strong goal that you achieve. So it wouldn't be a list of life practices that would make you promote space, because that's not something we can actually do very well. But it would be maybe, say, novels and movies, placed a few centuries into the future, like, say, The Expanse, where you go, yeah, we really want that world. That's the future we want to create. And you have heroes in those stories that you want to realize by making that world. And there's parts of that world that your family would be in or your country would be in. You want a really compelling vision that people are engaged by and then are willing to sacrifice for. And
very interesting. So I do wonder along these lines to what extent multiple goals of this sort can coexist. For instance, Luis Arroyo writes in our chat, you can't prioritize space and be egalitarian. Did I get that right? Or he hopes he misheard this, but I'm thinking, could there be essentially a polygoal where you have multiple visions of the future that are compatible, that essentially illustrate a different and better paradigm of existence? So that could be radical life extension, space colonization, universal abundance, like everybody gets a 3D printed mansion, and a lot of other attributes of a prosperous society, which I think everybody would agree, at least from a high level vantage point, this would lead to better lives for people. Can you have a vision that is not just one achievement, but achievements in a variety of areas which are not in conflict with one another necessarily, except to the extent that you could decide, well, do I want to devote my efforts to space exploration, or do I want to, say, study biology and biotechnology, devote my efforts to life extension? So people could choose different career paths, but perhaps within a broader paradigm, we could call it transhumanism, we could call it something else, but it's the pursuit of that next stage in the development of our species. How feasible would that be as a vision to motivate people?
So if civilization declines, as it most likely would unless we do something to prevent it, that would be along a path where we are achieving many of the goals we want at the time, including being egalitarian, having democratic participation, being careful not to offend people. There are a great many goals that we have that are not in conflict with civilization decline, where putting a large weight on those goals wouldn't prevent civilization decline. We would decline while achieving those goals. There are some goals that happen to be in conflict with civilization decline, and then some of those are more transhumanist type goals because they're about grand achievements that require a lot of effort and capability, and that therefore civilization decline would prevent. So the whole point is to put more weight on that second set of goals relative to the first. If you just put weight on making sure people are entertained and relaxed and have fun and have vacation and are heard when they have objections to things, and we are, aren't offended by inequality, et cetera, those goals are quite consistent with decline. And if we put most of our weight on those goals, we will just achieve them while declining. To prevent decline, we need to put a lot of weight on goals that happen to conflict with decline. And that's the hard part here. Now, you could pick 10 goals that happen to conflict with decline and put some weighted average on all of them, but you have to be careful at how you put the weighted average. If you do some sort of an or thing, if we achieve any one of these 10, okay, great. If we have to achieve all of them, then it's just going to be really hard to achieve all 10 goals, and then you're just going to basically not achieve your goal of achieving all 10. And so the market will realize, yeah, you can't do that, and just give up on it. So you need to give this governance mechanism a chance of actually achieving whatever goal you hand it. And so that doesn't have to be just one, but if you give more than one, you'll have to be in some sort of or sense. One or the other or these, like give them a list of any of these things, achieve any of these things, please. But all of those things will need to be things that are inconsistent with decline. That's the hardest part here. So yes, the issue is you put enough weight on being egalitarian, you will just achieve an egalitarian world, but that can be a world of decline.
Yes, fair enough. And actually, this was one of the issues with the rise of early Christianity, which was more egalitarian in a sense than the structure of the Roman Empire that preceded it, but it was very compatible with decline. Edward Gibbon made that argument. But it's interesting, too, you mentioned 10 goals. So I created this new decades message for the 2020s right at the end of 2019. And in it, I outlined 10 goals that I thought would be reasonable and desirable for humankind to achieve in this decade. Now, clearly, I did not have any anticipation of COVID being as devastating as it was. But right now, more than 5 years into this decade, I know that one of the goals has been achieved. I am not confident about several of the others. A few of the others could still be achieved, and I will briefly read those goals out because I think they may be interesting to consider from the standpoint of whether any or most or all of them could be at least incorporated into a sacred goal. So the first goal is to construct the next world's tallest building. After the Burj Khalifa, which was built in 2010. I think this could still be done somewhere in Saudi Arabia. And it seems to me as long as humans are building taller skyscrapers, that requires at least some civilizational infrastructure that is incompatible with decline. Second goal, build a base on the moon. Ambitious. Maybe it will happen in the next 5 years. I'm not fully confident about that. Goal number 3, land a human on Mars. Again, that's still not beyond the realm of possibility, but human societies have just distracted themselves with a bunch of nonsense in the early part of this decade. Another goal, establish the first fully operational seastead communities. Again, still conceivable, but it requires a jurisdiction willing to tolerate it. Then goal number 5, unfortunately, I'm increasingly doubting that this could happen this decade. Have at least one person live beyond 120 years again, particularly because there's just one person alive today who could conceivably reach the age of 120, and she's 116 at present. Goal number 6, cut all world nuclear weapons stockpiles in half. Reagan and Bush did more than that, Bush Sr., of course, but given the geopolitical situation in the world today, that seems unlikely to be achieved this decade unless there's a major turn toward peace. Goal number 7, compose 100 tonal symphonies. To my surprise, that has already been exceeded by a fairly significant margin. So that goal has been met. Goal number 8, develop medically effective cures for every type of cancer. I remember when I was in middle school, I was told, well, of course, cancer will be cured by 2015. And I was still optimistic in 2019 that maybe this decade we could cure every type of cancer. Then goal number 9, end the decade with 50% of all vehicles on the road at level 2 autonomy or greater. That's not beyond the realm of possibility. I would still say unlikely, but maybe reachable in the 2030s. And then goal number 10, this one, regrettably, I doubt will be achieved this decade. Experience at least 1 year in which no country is at war with any other country, with war including armed insurgencies and terrorist attacks. So we've seen this decade the rise of war and belligerence and the kinds of ideologies that fuel them. So I don't think we're going to have a year without war or terrorism or armed insurgencies this decade. So what do you think of those goals? They were fairly modest for a transhumanist. I actually thought, what could be realistic if the 2020s turn out to be a fairly benign decade?
So there's a large space of possible goals one could define and a large space of purposes for which you could make them. And for the purpose of preventing civilization decline, we need goals on a particular time scale. So goals that you could achieve in the next 10 years, if we committed to achieving them, that won't necessarily prevent decline over a coming century or two. And a goal that you had for 1,000 or 10,000 years in the future also wouldn't really do much to prevent decline in the next century or two, because, hey, there'll be another civilization that'll rise a few centuries later, and then, hey, it might do stuff. Maybe it'll more depend on what that new civilization is than whether we decline. So in order to induce people to try to prevent civilization decline, you need them to pick goals on the time scale at which decline would get in the way of that. And the goals you were picking were more things achievable in the next 10 years or so. So if we make this new tallest building, we could do that and civilization still declines. It's not actually changing our world so that we're less likely to decline exactly. It's just doing a achievement that we can be proud of. Now, maybe it would change our attitudes towards future achievements such that we'll want to do more like that in the future, and that might prevent decline. But those would be more indirect consequences of achieving a goal like that. Maybe trying to change culture in some way that makes those goals more respected. As you know, we've had a number of stated goals of governments in the last few years in terms of, say, carbon use decline, right? So if you look at what are the goals that the world has most said, signed treaties and made statements about, we want to achieve this goal, they are things like reducing less carbon, right? But that's quite consistent with civilization decline. In fact, civilization decline probably would, in fact, cause carbon reduction. So unfortunately, even though those could be good goals to pursue, they don't plausibly actually induce us to be less likely to decline.
Yes, interesting. And I do understand the point that some great achievement, including a technical achievement like building the world's tallest skyscraper, may not necessarily avert the decline of an entire civilization. It could be, as you alluded to, a source of inspiration for people. They could realize, oh, great things are still being done. We want to continue that momentum, continue to do great things, continue to achieve great things, and therefore we need to sustain that civilizational base that makes those achievements possible.
Now, I could pick you another project that might be more related to preventing decline. So let's, maybe the most likely groups to replace us would be, say, the Amish or Haredim, who are not especially pro-technology and have many concerns about our dominant culture and it polluting them. So there's a risk that when they are the rising civilization, they will be wary of, looking up our old libraries or old media and other things that we've said in the past because they are afraid of being polluted by all of that. And maybe that would delay the rise of the next civilization. And so we might make a project where we try to make lots of little, basically USB drives full of civilization world of information that we scatter around the world to make it easy for future people to find them and read them and build again. That would be a long-term project that would be less about preventing this decline, but more about enabling the next rise.
Very interesting. And I'm aware actually of some books that have been published along these lines, like A Handbook to Rebuild Civilization. Right. It has a similar title to that, and it has a lot of diagrams of essentially various technologies that could potentially be replicated in a future less advanced society, but could bring up the level of advancement fairly rapidly. So it is an interesting idea. I am just hoping that the decline could be averted to some extent. And I am seeing signs of the decline relative to, say, 2015. So one hypothesis that I hold somewhat loosely in my mind, just based on my personal experience and recollection of what culture was like, is that the current, let's say, dominant culture in the world, you might call it the monoculture, peaked around 2015 in terms of its success and efficacy and ability to implement beneficial change. And since that time, it has been torn apart by polarization, but also certain declining material standards of living, the affordability crisis being one of them, certain periods of declining life expectancy, deaths of despair. All of these would not be happening in a prospering, improving culture. So some malaise has set in over the past decade. I don't know yet whether that's a local decline or whether that is the prelude to a more pronounced decline. And the view that you've articulated, which ties it to the fertility decline, would suggest it's the beginning of a more pronounced decline. Now, other people disagree, including some of our audience members, but it's definitely worth exploring. And my hope is maybe we're early enough, if this is a prelude to a larger decline, that we could arrest that decline somehow, especially if we achieve a major surge of technological progress in the next decade or two. So I'm trying to find some sort of goal, and for that goal to be sufficiently inspiring to people to overcome the internal rifts within the monoculture. So especially the left-right polarization, that has been just so pernicious, because we don't have a situation where we have the kind of cultural competition you described previously, where there are little cultures competing with one another. It seems like the monoculture has split into two blocks, and the sacred goal of each block is to destroy the other block, which is very damaging in my view. But what do you think about that? Do you see that as a great obstacle to uniting the culture around a sacred goal?
It is an obstacle to sharing a goal. Now, we do, in both the left and the right do actually share many goals. They're just not very eager to point to or emphasize the goals that they share. They're much more eager to point to and emphasize the goals that they differ on, because that's what energizes their conflict. As you may know, when you can find a bipartisan support for some policy, that's suddenly when nobody cares about the policy. It doesn't get proposed and doesn't get acted on, because what people want to do is own the libs or own the other side, and they're looking to find a policy that they can pass that will somehow shame or make the other side harder to achieve their goals. And that's what much of politics is about these days, is about finding ways to beat the other side. That is an obstacle to finding a shared goal that we could all get behind and feel very motivated by. 2016 was the peak of births worldwide. Births per month or whatever has been declining since then. And so, there's a delay for population to start decline, which is the average age at which people die. So that's why, 2016 is the peak of births, but the peak of population will be more like 2055, say, 40 years later. And that's, a relatively clear measure of the fertility and population decline is the peak of births. I agree that it's hard to tell in many other kinds of cultural parameters to what extent they are caused by cultural drift versus not, and to what extent they were just part of fluctuations going up and down as opposed to long-term trends. Those are, in fact, hard to tell. I did have, if you want to go over them, some sort of theories to explain some of the consistent trends over the last few centuries in cultural change. It's not all just random.
Yes, please do.
I think I even have a slide in here about that somewhere. But the point is that one kind of cultural drift is, in fact, these random walks. But I guess I don't have that there. Anyway, one ways you could have a trend is if, say, there was a human nature, and then cultural evolution pulled us away from human nature in order to, say, be farmers. So if you can think of maybe our forager long ago, our human nature was pretty well adapted to that environment. And then cultural evolution took over and was able to move us away from our habit once upon a time to be more appropriate for a new world, like the world of farming, and maybe now the modern world. So if selection pressures would weaken, as plausibly they did in the last few centuries, then one of the predictions is we would just drift back more toward human nature. And that would be an explanation for many trends. So one set of stories of that form, if we say human nature is naturally lazy, selfish, and present-oriented, then that would be a trend you might expect over the last few centuries. As selection pressures weaken, we become more lazy, selfish, and present-oriented. Another sort of story is to say, well, we were once foragers and then we became farmers, but as selection pressures weaken, we've drifted back to be more like foragers. And that can explain a number of trends in the last few centuries in terms of value changes. It explains, more leisure, more travel, more art, more promiscuity, more democracy, less religion, less fertility, less domination of all sorts, more concerned with the environment. All of those trends are plausibly ways in which we have become more forager-like over the last few centuries. And so this theory would predict we would continue in that direction if there's still room to go in those directions. Now, many people like this. That is, the idea is instead of adapting to the world around us, we've looked inside ourselves and said, what feels right? And that's been a driver of many youth movements over these years, is youth saying what feels right, and then they want to change the culture around them to match what feels right, and plausibly forager ways feel right. And so we have been moving back, and many people think this is great. It feels great that we are becoming more closer to our ideals of what sort of attitudes feel right inside. But if these are not adaptive in the new world, then these are just ways in which we are drifting away from what's adaptive, even though it feels right.
Yes, and that is a concern of mine as well. It does seem to me like the predominant, let's say, attitude in Western culture changed circa, I'd say, the late 1960s from do what makes rational sense in some more universal manner to do what feels right. If it feels good, do it. And to a large extent, these virtual enlightenment salons are an attempt at a mild antidote to that, where we actually reason through particular questions instead of just adopting initial feelings-based inclinations. And I just wish we had more of a broad base of cultural discourse that's oriented more toward reason than toward initial emotional responses.
Well, I mean, I think one way to think about this is there's what strategies will achieve our values and what are our values. So you're saying we want to be reasonable, but often what people mean by reasonable is to be effective at achieving your values. But then when they look at these, they say, no, these are value questions. And we are now being more true to our values. But your values come from your culture. And your values can be wrong in an adaptive sense. That is, cultural evolution is this process that's designed, that's there to produce more adaptive behavior. And it'll choose your values in order to make your behavior adaptive. And then if it's broken, it will no longer be choosing your behavior to be adaptive. And then your culture will become less adaptive. In civilization terms, it will shrink and go away. So, but many people feel like I'm really attached to my values. I'm okay with my civilization going away as long as we can just keep pursuing our values for as long as it lasts.
Yes, there are people like that. So there are people, for instance, who are antinatalists who think, well, it's okay even if humanity declines and dies out eventually, as long as people get to do what they want while the current cohort of people are alive. Right. And that seems to be a rather limiting perspective in my view. So I have no problem.
It's going to go away.
Mm-hmm. Right.
That is, as long as there's some part of our world that becomes more adaptive, the less adaptive parts will go away. So I think the way I'd like to say it is, look, if there's something you value, whatever it is, if you want it to be there in the future, you need to tie it to adaptive stuff, because only adaptive stuff lasts. You don't care about the future, okay, fine, enjoy your values as long as they last, but the future will be full of adaptive stuff. And if you want your thing to be in the future, say democracy, you like democracy, you want more democracy in the future, well, you're going to make sure democracy is tied to adaptive creatures, adaptive behaviors, because otherwise it'll go away. I happen to value, say, open inquiry. If I'm going to pick most fundamental value, the thing I will sacrifice other things for, it's that. But even then, I think open inquiry can last. It can be part of an adaptive package. And I want to tie it to other adaptive things so it can last. But I want things that represent me and that are parts of me and that have parts that are like me to be there in the future. I want, therefore, to be adaptive. I want to find ways in which things like me and the parts of me can be parts of things that don't lose out in the adaptive competition, so that they are there in the future and can push for the things I like there.
Absolutely. And I agree with you. Open inquiry is a fundamental value. It's interesting, too, that in a lot of traditional cultures, open inquiry was frowned upon. In some cases, it was suppressed. And in the current, what you would characterize as the global monoculture, there is more tolerance for open inquiry than historically there used to be, and that is a value worth preserving. Certainly, we hold that to be a high value because we engage in it very often in the virtual enlightenment salons and in general in the transhumanist movement. So absolutely, it's essential for the cultures that value open inquiry to prevail over cultures that would suppress it, at least within cultures that suppress it, give people a choice to escape them and give people a choice to move to societies where open inquiry is valued. Now, Art Ramon had an interesting comment about foragers becoming shoppers. So, Art Ramon, maybe you would like to elaborate on that. And if you have any other questions or comments too, this is a good opportunity.
Sure. Yeah, if there is a natural state of humanity before we became, farmers, foraging. So shopping is a lot like foraging, and people love to shop. So that's kind of going back to our nature. And I did have sort of an idea or a question. Remember the Georgia Guidestones? They had all the inscriptions, maintain humanity under 500 million, so forth. And I was looking at those and thinking of your concept here. And a lot of them, I think, don't really support continued civilization. I think they're all pretty on the downcline. So be not a cancer on the earth. Leave room for nature. Room for nature. It's prize truth, beauty, love, seeking harmony with the infinite. So, yeah, something to note.
Right. So if you in the past, if you thought of yourself as representing a civilization, being an advocate for a civilization, say like the Roman Empire, you want it to grow and to be more capable, have more people, more technological. And that's a vision of, say, the American Empire that many Americans had, or of the Soviet Empire that many Soviet citizens had. Up until, half century or so ago, many people were quite consciously wanting their civilization to be more physically prominent in the world, to have more technology, more people, more buildings, more roads, more stuff, and to be bigger. And then in the last half century or so, one of the big changes of cultural activism has been to make people value that less and to more value, as you described, a more minimal impact on the world. And unfortunately, we can quite easily achieve a more minimal impact by a decline in civilization. That's quite consistent with civilization decline. And that means many people have said, no, decline sounds good. There's less environmental impact and fewer people causing problems. And that is those are common values today.
Yes, and that is unfortunate that those are common values, that some people think that damage done by humans in some sphere or spheres of life is so significant that it would be a better outcome for human civilization itself or humanity itself to decline. And of course, as a transhumanist, I'm strongly opposed to that point of view. I want humanity to prosper, and I think human civilization is fundamentally good. But it's interesting that Art Ramon mentioned the Georgia Guidestones. Here's the Wikipedia entry on them. This is a monument that existed from 1980 to 1922. And this was, in essence, a statement of values by its creators, a statement of goals for the civilization. We may disagree with some of them, but it evoked such a strong reaction from, let's say, traditionalist Christians that somebody bombed it, somebody vandalized it to some extent, to such an extent in 2022 that it was ultimately torn down. It couldn't be salvaged. So this also raises a concern about framings of civilizational goals that might be so provocative to certain fanatics that at least certain manifestations of those goals would attract severe hostility. And I suppose that's not a new problem. We've had fanatics throughout history, but from the standpoint of a movement that is, let's say, not that inclined to do actual combat, how do we frame civilizational goals to avoid that kind of response, to avoid some group of people saying, well, no, you're just evil and satanic, etc., and we are going to physically fight you?
So I think one key issue worth highlighting here that is a problem with the approach I've described is that we often have explicit values that we state in words that we put on monuments like this, and then we have implicit values in our behavior that are at odds with that. For example, a common observation, excluding by my colleague Brian Kaplan in an upcoming book, is that capitalism gives us stuff we want, but we aren't so proud of wanting. And we often task government with giving us things we say we want, even if when we choose privately, we don't tend to choose them. And so that's a problem with more explicit goals in governance. So I think like a function of democracy is often that we can say we will like trees and we want a lot more trees and trees are really important to us. And a politician will say, yes, I will support the trees. I will do everything for trees. Please elect me and I will do the tree thing. And then we elect them and he doesn't because he knows we didn't actually want the trees that much. What we wanted was to be able to say we wanted the trees. And ordinary democracy supports hypocrisy in that way. And that's a virtue of it to the extent we want hypocrisy, which apparently we do. But a mechanism like futarchy, which I described, requires that we explicitly pick a goal and that it will actually successfully achieve that goal. So now that's a problem if the goals we are tempted to say we want aren't actually the goals we want, because we will in fact get the things we say we want through that process, not the things we want. Another nice example, I think, is to think about regular police where there's an implicit, goals given by the mayor to the police, what neighborhoods count, what crimes count or something, versus if we had an explicit bounty system where we put a particular dollar amount on each crime and then the priorities for crime would be based on those dollar amounts. With an explicit bounty system, we'd either have to treat all the neighborhoods equally or be explicit saying some neighborhoods don't count as much as other ones. With the implicit police system, we in fact decide some neighborhoods count a lot more than others, but we don't have to say so. We pretend they all count the same. So now with futarchy, we will have a mechanism that will be very effective plausibly at achieving a stated goal, but then will we be willing to state to it the goal we actually have? So I do think there's a substantial risk that wanting to protect the environment and wanting equality and egalitarian and not offending people would be, in fact, the goals people say they want. And then the mechanism would be very effective at achieving that. And if what they implicitly wanted was to grow and become wealthy and prosperous and have large, capable technology, but if they aren't willing to say that's what they want, then they don't achieve it. So that's showing that the scenario I described is a somewhat of a big ask. First of all, we have to prove this governance mechanism works. We have to get people on board with a sacred goal that's inconsistent with civilization decline and give it to that mechanism. And we have to be willing to admit that that goal is the goal we want.
Right.
If we are wanting to instead say other things like these goals on this monument you described, then that's what will happen. We will actually achieve those things and civilization would then decline.
Yes, and of course, getting people to explicitly acknowledge a lot of the goals and values that they implicitly practice has been a challenge for transhumanists because, as I have articulated before, a lot of people are implicit transhumanists in terms of how they use technology, but
they want to live one more day every day.
Yes.
So implicitly they want to live forever, but they don't want to say they want to live forever. They say they want a finite life, but every day they want to live one more day.
Right. And it's this cultural reluctance to explicitly articulate the implicit goals that will be a significant obstacle and I think will take a lot of cultural activism to overcome. Now, an interesting related question comes to us from Didier Cornell, And he wonders, how do you explain that our cultures are creating so many BS tasks, which I understand to be work that does not benefit anyone from being done? And that's in a lot of systems organizations, whether private or governmental. Is it the result of this tension between explicit goals and implicit goals? Like in a lot of organizations, they will say, oh, we value diversity, which is fine, but now we have a chief diversity officer, and we have this entire bureaucracy that focuses on diversity that ends up making work for itself, whereas you might not need that work to actually have meaningful diversity. You just have people willing to engage in open inquiry or something of that nature.
So I talked earlier about corporate cultures, and that in general, for-profit corporate culture, the process seems to be relatively healthy because there is a lot of selection and a lot of variety that can produce selection for healthy corporate cultures. And that would suggest that when they choose which jobs there are, those are reasonable choices. The ways in which that wouldn't happen is when the larger macroculture pressures each corporation to do certain things. Otherwise, it will face, disapproval from the larger world. So that can be, DEI, or it can be ESG, or it can be regulatory required, activities, or just things that if you didn't do, then somebody's, exposed you, that you would face social shame and disapproval. And so those sorts of processes can end up creating jobs and activities that may in fact not actually be very useful, but are useful for the purpose of convincing regulators or the public that you are a good person somehow or not a bad person. And culture is in charge of those sorts of things. For example, in a world that was racist, which there was such a world in our world recently, then if you put the wrong sort of race people in front of their customers as a, service person or as a person in a shop, then you would face disapproval because the world would not like your choice there, and they would be seeing it, and you could be shamed and punished for doing so, right? So you would have to keep a public appearance consistent with whatever are the norms of that community, even if that wasn't the profit maximizing thing to do otherwise. But your need to maintain an appearance and to be accepted would be driving your behavior.
Yes, interesting. And I see you have on your slides your cultural drift fix, and let's venture into futarchy a bit. Explain a bit more some of the mechanics of how it would work, and also how gaming of the system could be prevented. So, for instance, let's say we have a sacred goal, and it could be radical life extension framed in some way, but then there's another constituency that has a lot of money that wants to smuggle in some of those other goals. So if there's a betting market, it could use those resources to essentially recalibrate the bet to some extent so that one outcome is more favored than it would have been otherwise. How does a futarchy system prevent that?
So I talked to this slide briefly, early in our session. The idea is we have some overall metric that we're wanting to achieve that we state, and there's a formula for it. And then at any one time, there's an asset that pays off in proportion to that metric, and there's a current price for that asset. And that price gives us an expected value in the market for that metric that we decided is what we're trying to achieve. Now, the argument here is that we put a substantial weight in that metric on a goal like when do 1 million people live in space, or when do average lifespans go above 150 or something. But we wouldn't put all our weight on that. Clearly, we'd also want just society to keep functioning. And so we would also put substantial weight on the usual goals of, having not war and not death and, wealth, etc. Those would be the usual sort of goals you would do if you didn't have this extra special sacred goal long term, that these are just practical things you would want to be achieving. So now, one problem could be you just might not put enough weight on the long-term sacred goal, and then market decides that's too hard, forget it. We're just going to pursue these things we know how to do, and that's what they achieve, right? So you want to put enough weight on it. And again, we talked before how if you add too many constraints to how this must be achieved, it'll also go, yeah, I can't do that, and just quit. So you'll need to give it enough freedom with how it pursues the goal and express it in a general enough way that it could figure out how to do so. But there's always going to be this temptation of people who have policies to just want to put their policy in as a goal. So for example, say, the question is, how many roads should we have? Well, if you think of roads as an instrument to get other things, you will, have the policy about roads be based on, well, does it let people get to their work? Does it let people get to vacation? Does it save them time? How much does it cost? The system will consider those trade-offs in the benefits and costs of roads in deciding how many roads to make. But say you just want more roads because you make roads, say. Well, what you might try to do is get the number of roads just stuck in the outcome metric. We just count the number of roads, and then ta-da, guess what? The market decides, I guess we need more roads because, hey, if we put more roads in, then the outcome metric goes up, and that's our job, to make the metric go up. So it's a problem if we try to put means in where ends should be. But there'll be a temptation to try to do that, and so somehow the system will have to be watching out for that and resisting it, because if it doesn't, everybody will just put their favorite means in, and we'll end up just, having some sort of mix of means that are whatever people have the political power to push to get their means to have a higher weight. Just kind of what happens now. So in ordinary democracy today, the legislature passes bills that spend money on different purposes, and that's a net effect of not only what people want, but what they think will have what effect, and just, how much political power they have to push things. And so our current system is an amalgam of those sorts of things. And the goal of futarchy is to say, if you could just pick what you want as the outcome, there's this other process that could be a lot more effective at figuring out how to get it. And you would empower that process by setting up this mechanism and just telling it what you want, but not how to get it. But a way to corrupt that is to say, no, I want to tell it how to get it because I want to make roads because I make roads.
Interesting. So the futarchy needs to be limited to the goal as such, but not as to the means. What do you conceive of as being, let's say, the governance structure that sets the goal? So would it be, let's say, transhumanists come to power and there's some sort of decision made saying, okay, we are going to prioritize radical life extension as the goal, period. Now, the market that gets set up in the futarchy figures out the sequence of steps, the means, etc., and people place their bets on various approaches. Is that the framework?
So at some point, we would have to adopt this competent form of governance, and then it would have a goal, and maybe initially would have a very plain goal in terms of wealth and peace and lifespans and leisure time. You just have some simple weighted average of the ordinary plain goals that people might have. And then at some point, some people would say, no, we need to have this long-term sacred goal, and that needs to be important. And then if there's enough people elected who share that belief that we need to have that, they would then pass a bill that would change the metric of the system, that change the outcome we're trying to achieve. And if it puts a large enough weight on, say, when we achieve immortality of a certain sort, then the market process that adopts policies would start to prioritize that. That is, as soon as we put a high weight on immortality, then somebody says, let's pass a bill for more funding for, life longevity research. And the speculators go, yeah, we think that if you funded that longevity research and your goal here was this lifespans, then in fact, you would in fact, on average, be more likely to achieve your goals by that sort of longevity research plan. And then that would pass. And then the next year, somebody might say, well, it's good to have longevity research, but you're doing it the wrong way. The way you're funding it is not very effective. Let's try this other, maybe prize-based way to fund longevity research. And then the market might say, yeah, that does sound good. Let's change how we give out the money. No longer, again, we get to government employees, but now setting up prizes. And then you would switch then. And repeatedly, you'd have people proposing changes, and then the market would either say, nah, that doesn't look like it'll work, or say, no, that does look like it'll work. And each time the market says, yeah, we approve, then that would become the new policy. And now taxes would change, benefits would change, all the policies would change as a result of the market saying, Yep, that looks like our best guess of what will achieve these goals that you specified. But of course, people in the next year might say, yeah, we don't want to put so much emphasis on longevity. Yes, it's a nice long-term goal, but it sounds too expensive at the moment. We're paying an awful lot for all these things we're doing that. Let's cut it back. And then it might start to cut back how much of a weight they put on it because they started to see that it was expensive. And then that's the key question here. Would they continue to put enough weight on it so that the market would start to do things that prevent civilization decline? Because it says, look, if civilization decline, we're just not going to achieve this. So we need to prioritize that because that's what the metric here is.
Very interesting. Now, have you given some consideration to Goodhart's law and the problems that it might pose? So Goodhart's law states that when a measure becomes a target, it ceases to be a good measure for various reasons. Like in a corporation, if some manager discovers, teams that have been successful have this particular attribute, and then they start to explicitly measure and target that attribute, and it turns out there are ways in which that attribute could be maximized without having the underlying, let's say, virtues or competencies that you actually want. Is there a way in a futarchy to avoid speculators essentially maximizing something, including for the sheer purpose of earning a monetary return, but then that thing that's maximized becomes detached from the sacred goal or what we want to achieve through the sacred goal?
Our world is full of metrics that continue to function even when they are targets here of activity, right? So, for example, corporations continue to be organized to make profits, and they like to play accounting games sometimes with that, but they have limited ability to pretend to have profits when they don't. They, for example, paying off dividends is a way to show that you have got money that you can pay that you achieve from profits. There's grade inflation, for example. So, students get paid for having higher degrees, and that's continued, but as grade inflation increases, they don't all get paid more because they all have more A's, right? So the metric is more, well, what's your rank in the school, and that's what your GPA, because the rank is harder to mess with, right? And so our world is full of deaths. Dead bodies you can count, and that's a metric that we try to reduce the number of dead bodies. And yes, people might try to take someone who's alive and miserable and keep them alive just so that they can make sure there aren't as many dead bodies, but it turns out to be hard to keep miserable bodies alive without actually making sure they live longer. That is, our world is full of metrics that roughly do function, even though they are the target of people's intentional activities to look good.
Yes, fair enough. And this has been such a fascinating conversation. We are nearing the last 2 minutes. I, as always, wish we had more time, but I did want to ask you one final question from one of our audience members, Alan Crowley. I think this is a fascinating question. Do you think linguistic drift is a companion to cultural drift? And he mentions Orwellian terms like newspeak and doublespeak, which can obscure certain truths. If there is deleterious cultural drift, do we see it accompanied by changes in the way people use language, which may even prevent a culture from being resilient against that cultural drift?
I don't know is my most basic answer, because I don't study language that much. The key thing would be when language elements are the sorts of things that individuals can be different on, and that's okay, then the selection will be within culture selection, which is something we do well on. So, for example, developing new terminology for a technical field. I expect that most new terminology is in fact useful for that new technical field because different people in that field could choose to use different words and they're competing, and it turns out those are the words that work better. It's more words that are tied to sort of our basic shared values and norms that it would be hard to vary. So, for example, what is it to be racist? That term is a very contested shared term, and you aren't allowed to just have your own definition of it. You can be, people complain if you make up your own definition of that word and use it differently than other people, and they need that concept to be somewhere. And so because we all share the same concept together with the same word, then we could together drift badly in terms of what concept we use and what it means. So it would be quite plausible that maybe we once had a more useful concept of racist, and now we picked a different concept of racist that's actually worse for all of us, but each one of us must go along with it because it's the shared concept the culture enforces.
Yes. Well, thank you for that answer, and thank you for joining us today. This has definitely been highly enlightening. Daniel Tweed writes, Robin is so good, I feel like I should be paying tuition. This has been a great workshop, in essence, for us transhumanists on perhaps possible ways that we can formulate grand civilizational goals to help.
I want to thank you because I've been trying to get people to take this problem seriously for the last few years. And the fact that you invite me back to talk about the same subject, I take as a sign you see the problem as important. I convinced you a bit that this was not just any other topic. This was a maybe important thing that we face that you want to dive in further. And I'm happy to see people see that this is an important problem. This is bigger than just me or some little, fun news item. This is civilization level issue.
Absolutely. It is a civilization level issue. And as Daniel Tweed writes, the longer people live, the greater care they will take to improve the world. And that's definitely an outcome that we would want. So thank you very much for joining us today and continuing the conversation in hopes that we may all live long and prosper.